Welcome to CHED Connect, a higher education open educational resource application. CHED Connect contains higher education materials which are useful for teaching, learning, and research purposes. It allows learners and educators to access content anytime, anywhere, free of charge. No registration needed. Just type in the keyword of the topic you wish to search. Click on the categories of the Philippine Standard Classification of Education and browse your way to its rich content. PhilChat Connect is easy to use. Just key in your area of interest. The site offers different relevant and interesting materials to choose from. Scholarly prepared, accomplished, and uploaded by competent faculty members and contributors from various partner Philippine higher education institutions. Guided by the principles of open educational resources, these materials such as PDF, audio files, ebooks, presentations, videos, and many more are very beneficial. PhilChed Connect. We educate as one.
Assessment is an integral part of educative process, and in this time where shift is needed from the traditional to flexible mode, it is deemed necessary to know the alternative ways to still ensure quality amidst difficulties. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our ninth webinar entitled Ensuring High Quality Assessment in Flexible Learning. This webinar is broadcasted live via HECBOL's Facebook page and YouTube channel. This activity is also made possible in partnership with the Ministry of Basic, Higher, and Technical Education in Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. This afternoon, a highly competent person will be sharing his expertise in the field of assessment. I am Eden Stephanie Bolido, your moderator this afternoon. To formally begin this program, please help me welcome the Director of the Commission on Higher Education HECBOL Project, Dr. Nelia A. Alibin.
Thank you, Eden. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to once again welcome all of you to HECBOL Online. This is our ninth webinar entitled Ensuring High Quality Assessment in Flexible Learning. This is part of CHED-HECBOL Project's capability building activities for the higher education institutions in the country, most especially to the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao or BARMM. The webinar today focuses on creating and developing high-quality assessments for students in a flexible class. It's a difficult time for teachers. They have to face so many considerations and challenges from integrating offline instruction to online learning and to what kind of instructional strategies, learning resources, digital tools, and assessment methods to be used for flexible learning. Colleges and universities are working to ensure that students are still getting quality assured degree under these unexpected circumstances. Teachers and parents have had to quickly adapt to teaching in this new reality to ensure that students engage in learning. That is why student assessment is very important. Learning assessment, by definition, is a fundamental feedback mechanism in education, allowing all stakeholders of the learning process to understand what is being learned and where learning resources need to be focused. For today, I am so glad that we have a very credible speaker when it comes to student assessment, no other than Dr. Dennis Alonzo, the Director of the Bachelor of Education program of the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Kensington, Australia. I have known him for several years now, a very good USEP colleague, the previous Dean of the College of Education from the University of Southeastern Philippines. Thank you, Dennis, for accepting CHED's invitation. As an end note to all our followers, I want to express my gratitude on behalf of the Commission on Higher Education and, of course, the HECBOL Project. We hope that you continue to watch our future webinars, follow our HECBOL FB page, and subscribe to our HECBOL YouTube channel for some updates about higher education, about CHED activities, and of course, other reminders. I express my sincere thanks to all the many individuals from CHED, the BARMM Ministry's Basic, Higher, and Technical Education, to all our subscribers. Let us continue to contribute to the success of higher education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Nelia, for that opening remarks. In our eighth webinar, we were oriented by Dr. Gina on the mechanics and principles of faculty assessment in an online class. To continue the momentum and see a different perspective to ensure quality assessment in flexible class, ladies and gentlemen, let me formally introduce to you our resource speaker. Our resource speaker is the Bachelor of Education Program Director of the University of New South Wales, Sydney. He is a test and scale developer, program evaluator, curriculum developer, and applied statistician. His area of interest revolves around assessment for learning, particularly in supporting teachers to make highly contextualized, consistent, fair, and trustworthy assessment decisions to effectively support student learning. He has been involved in a number of international and national research projects and publications. He also researches on broad range of topics, including student IT experiences, blended and online learning, standards-based assessment, and learning analytics to help inform curriculum design, professional development, and policy. He received various scholarships from the Philippines, including academic scholarship for his Bachelor of Science in Biology, where he graduated cum laude, and DOST Philippine Council for Advanced Science and Technology Research and Development Scholarship for his Master of Science in Biology, both degrees completed at Mindanao State University Iligan Institute of Technology. He also received scholarships from the Australian government, including the Australian Development Scholarship for Master in Assessment and Evaluation at the University of Melbourne and the Australian Development Scholarship for his PhD in Education at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. He received also a fellowship grant from the University of New South Wales in 2016. Further, he was a recipient of a public diplomacy scholarship from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea. He was a former dean of the College of Education of the University of Southeastern Philippines before joining UNSW. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great honor that I present to you our speaker, Dr. Dennis Alonzo.
Thanks, Eden. Mayong hapon sa tanan. Good afternoon,
Sir
everyone.
Dennis.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for gracing this event, and you may have the floor, sir.
Thank you. To all the participants, thank you very much for your time today. And allow me to give you about an hour lecture. Let's see what we can do for 1 hour. A topic that's very important and a topic that we normally teach for one semester in the School of Education here. And I'll try to condense that in 1 hour to give you a good background about assessment and how to implement assessment strategies inside a classroom. I'm going to share my screen. Right.
Oh, okay. That's all right. Then if they got entry to Master of Financial Analysis, they will get entry to Master of Commerce.
Okay, so I'll be talking about ensuring high quality assessment in flexible learning.
Yeah, I think Alia will.
Can you see my screen?
Process this one if there's a program change, and yeah, it's assigned already to Alia, so she will get into that.
Yes, sir. We can see your screen now.
Cool. Because there's a delay on Facebook or something. So I'll be talking about first about the underlying assumptions in implementing assessment. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit of the purpose of assessment, the principles of effective assessment practices. Then I'm going to go down to the roles and responsibilities of teachers in assessment. Then also talk about the roles and responsibilities of students in assessment. Then we're going to look at how to design assessment and implement, and some tips along the way. But before that, I'm going to introduce first UNSW as part of our standard operating procedure every time we are invited to speak. Now, UNSW is first in Australia, #1 university in terms of research excellence and impact. And we are in the top 50 in the world. In the 2020 QS University ranking, we are number 43. And we've known to have the reputation for most employable graduates. And yep, we've got a very good reputation in terms of research excellence. And that's where today's talk, I'm going to draw much from my work in the area of assessment and use the materials from my research. And also, we're leader in education. We're a member of the prestigious Group of 8, a coalition of Australia's leading research-intensive universities. And in terms of our academic reputation, we are number 37 in the world in 2019 QS World University ranking. And we say at UNSW, we never stand still. So today I'm going to demonstrate with you how to do a blended learning online kind of assessment, a combination of formative assessment and many other types of assessment. I'd like everyone to go to that website, paulev.com, Dennis Alonzo 864, and answer the question there. When you hear the word assessment, what related concepts come up in your mind? So go to paulev.com/Dennis Alonzo 864. I'll put that in the chat as well. And let's see. And I'd like everyone to participate as much as you can. So go there, pull that everywhere dot slash. When you hear the word assessment, what related concepts come up in your mind? Just to look at your understanding about assessment. And that's where I'm going to start my discussion in the next few minutes. So if you can go there and answer, that would be great. Oh, not. So we've got examinations, quizzes, evaluation, measurement, oral, exam, right? Keep going. Recitations, you've got tests. Objectives, yep. Measurement, right. The bigger the word, the more our responses. So we've got examination, collecting of information, and so on and so forth. All right. Now continue with the next activity. If you are to assess your knowledge and skills in implementing effective assessment in the classroom now, how would you rate yourself? I'll just quickly go through all of these activating prior knowledge. So there are those who are really competent. There are those who are in the mid, right? And others, yeah, they're a bit happy with their assessment ability. Let's see later. And then the next question, just keep on answering that one. And then let's see. What do you want to learn in relation to assessment today? So just trying to level up your expectation before I'll start my lecture. You wanted to learn about evaluation, measurement, authentic assessment, terminology, strategies, tips, right? Yep. Assessment, evaluation, that's good. All of those. All right. Okay, so I'll continue my lecture now. Now, we've seen there so many terminologies related to assessment. We've got formative assessment, summative assessment, feedback, and many others, evaluation, measurement. But when we talk about the purpose of assessment, we often argue that assessment should be for learning. Everything that we do, everything that we implement inside the classroom should be for learning. If we implement an assessment strategy that does not help students to learn effectively, then for sure we're not going to use that because it undermines the real purpose of assessment, that is to help students learn more effectively. And I'll be dealing so much with the role of assessment to improve student learning rather than from the side of measurement or rather than from the side of measuring assessment, learning, and student improvement. So why we're saying that assessment should be for learning? Because two studies, the seminal studies of Black and William and Hattie in 2009, showed that assessment that are implemented in the classroom with the purpose of improving student learning are the most effective, and they're the single factor that has the highest influence to improving student learning, particularly in the work of Hattie in 2009 with 100 different instructional and contextual factors. He was able to demonstrate that the use of assessment, particularly formative practice, self-assessment, and feedback, has the highest effect size in terms of improving student learning. And that's where the concept of assessment for learning was formalized in relation to what's really the purpose of assessment in the classroom. Now, these are some of the few things that we have to reflect before we move further to some of our discussions. One there, if any assessment activity will not help your students learn more effectively, then do not use it. Think of that. If you are implementing quizzes and that will not help your students to learn more effectively, then better not to use that. Second, if your assessment practices demotivate or disengage students from learning, then you are using the wrong approach. Remember, if there's one thing that students hate inside a classroom, that is assessment. So if we implement assessment activity and that assessment activity will demotivate our students or will disengage them from learning, then we are using the wrong approach. Now, third, if we are using assessment to penalize students, then you are not adhering to the principles of effective assessment practices, which I'm going to talk later about the principles of effective assessment practices. Sometimes we use assessment activities to, penalize students because they're not listening inside a classroom. And we say, get 1/4 sheet of pad paper, and then we're going to start our quizzes. But think of that practice. That's not within the principle of effective assessment practices. The fourth one, if you do not provide feedback to students and give them opportunities to use feedback to improve their learning output, then you are not an effective teacher. Meaning to say, feedback is an integral part of the assessment process. Feedback in a way that you talk about the strengths of the students, their weaknesses in relation to the task, and offer suggestions on how to further improve the work. And then fifth, if you do not integrate your assessment plan into lesson plan, course outline, then you do not adhere to the principles of transparency. Meaning to say, all assessment activities should be part of the lesson plan and the course outline, and these assessment activities should be communicated to the students. There should be no surprise quizzes, no surprise tests, no surprise assessment activities just because you wanted, you feel like giving an assessment during that particular day. You would. No, we have to make sure that everything should be transparent from the side of our students. So think of these 5 key points where we say the assessment should drive learning and teaching. Now, in the classroom, this is the relationship between or amongst learning, teaching, and assessment. The ultimate aim of our instruction is for our students to achieve the learning outcomes. And so we develop learning and teaching activities to help them achieve the learning outcomes. But at the same time, we develop assessment to help them in the learning and to help them monitor the learning. And at the end of our learning and teaching activities, we use assessment to make decisions to what extent our students have achieved the learning outcomes. And then there's contextual factors, which I'm going to discuss later towards the end of or towards the middle of my presentation. So think of this, the relationship amongst learning outcomes, learning and teaching activities, and assessment. One couldn't function without the other because they are supporting each other to achieve the learning outcomes. Now, in my presentation today, these are the following assumptions that we need to consider. First, we need to implement equitable assessment practices, meaning to say that we provide support and enabling mechanism for our students, regardless of their context, regardless of their background, for them to be successful in their learning and to be successful in the assessment activities. And second, we need to implement accessible assessment practices, tasks, and processes, meaning to say we need to make sure that even those students who are learning remotely will have equal success comparable to those students who are learning online. And third, there's typos there, from different backgrounds and have diverse learning needs. And we need to consider that. And not all students are self-directed, meaning we're going to look at their motivation. We're going to look at how good they are in acting on feedback and many other assessment activities. And students need supporting and enabling mechanisms to succeed in any assessment. So think of these 5 assumptions as we continue our discussion. But we have to remember that 50% of the variance observed in students' outcome is due to themselves, meaning to say that the ones learning and they need to take full responsibility of the learning. We teachers, we contribute only 30%. That's only our contribution, and the other 20% comes from school environment, culture, and other factors within the learning and teaching space. And we have to remember also that students' beliefs and perceptions filter, control, or shape their learning. And students' beliefs and perceptions are influenced by their ability levels. Now, if we map our students from high-performing to low-performing students, then you see different distributions in there. And so we need to take advantage of these beliefs and perceptions of the students, including their ability level, to make sure that we are implementing effective assessment strategies in our classroom. And I'm going to discuss later about how to do that. And the question now is, what is the magic bullet in assessment? Can we really standardize an assessment process given we come from different background, different context, particularly now in flexible learning modalities where you'll be doing some online blended learning and some modular approach given the current condition that we have with the pandemic. So the question is, what is the magic bullet in assessment? And can we really implement effective assessment strategies in this context? Now, we're going to answer this question later, but I'd like you to keep this in mind. And as I go talking about more of the principles, then I'd like you to reflect later if there is really a magic bullet in assessment. Now, I'd like to go back here about the relationships amongst learning, teaching, and assessment, and considering the contextual factors. The contextual factors are the factors that we don't have control, but we can modify them and address them. Say, for example, if we have this, situation where our students, the composition of our students, 20% of them have access to ICT, 10% with limited access, and 70% with no access to ICT. How do the learning and teaching activities look like in these three groups of students? Can we implement the same assessment, learning, and teaching activities for these three groups of students? Now, if we are going to design learning and teaching activities and assessment activities given this context where 20% of your students have access to ICT, only 10% with limited access, and 70% with no access to ICT, how would that look like? Now, when we design, given this context, we need to think about access and equity so that students from these three different groups will have equal access, equal opportunity, and they have the opportunity to demonstrate the learning in relation to the task that we require with them. But the question is, how do we design? And that's the question that we're going to answer as we go along with our discussion. All right. Now, so far, let's go to Poll Everywhere and check our understanding at the moment. Go back there to the Poll Everywhere. And then answer this one. Why do you implement assessment in the classroom? Why? So I'd like you to go to pollev.com again and then answer that question. Why do you implement assessment in the classroom? Because I'm going to, I'll use that as a springboard to discuss the purpose of evaluation. So you've got to evaluate learning, teaching, measure, right, to support learning of the students, to measure the effect, yep, and many other answers there. All right, strengths to measure, gauge effectiveness. So if you look at all the responses here, it's more on measurement, knowing, looking at the competencies to determine the strengths of the students, the prior knowledge, and so on and so forth. So thank you for your responses. Now, all these are valid purposes of assessment. All right. Okay. Now, with all those purposes that you've written, I'd like to go back to the original definition of assessment for learning. And it says there, it is the process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners and their teachers to decide where the learners are in the learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. Now, think of this phrase, used by learners and their teachers to decide where the learners are in their learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. Now, the user of the assessment for learning, the data, and everything that you've gathered, the evidence, are the students and the teachers. Now, putting into a framework that definition where the learners are, where they need to go, and how best to get there, this will provide you an information on how to properly design and assessment strategies. Where the learners are, you need to establish the current level of ability, prior learning of your students, their motivation, their interest, their learning needs, learning style. And where they need to go, you need to clearly articulate the intended learning outcomes, particularly that we are using outcomes-based education in the Philippines, and you're very, very familiar with the concept of outcomes-based education, that you need to be very, very explicit with the outcomes that you wanted your students to demonstrate by the end of the learning. And so you have to clearly articulate that, the knowledge and skills and the performance expected, or the criteria and standards. And this is our task, to bridge the gap where the learners are, where they need to go, and how best to get there. That's where we develop strategies, method of teaching, assessment strategies, identify resources and support needed, and support our students to move from their current level of understanding to the intended learning outcomes, to the performance where we expect them to reach. And keep in mind these three phrases: where the learners are, where they need to go, and how best to get there. Right. Now, we developed these principles of effective assessment practices as part of the literature review that we did, based on the work of Black and William, Assessment Reform Group, and Hattie, and Boods and Associate. Because I've been talking we need to look at where the learners are, where they need to go, and how best to get there. And all the things that we do inside the classroom should be underpinned by the effective principles of assessment for learning practices. Now, the first principle there is that assessment is a key professional skill. Notice that, or remember in the definition of assessment for learning, that students are part of the process. They're the ones they're the ones to use the evidence collected. And so, given that proposition by the Assessment Reform Group, the principles of effective assessment practices should be for students and for teachers. Remember that the variance observed amongst students is 50%. They're the ones learning, all right? And we need to make sure that we are helping them to learn effectively. Okay, so we've got there, students, they should develop their assessment literacy to effectively engage in any assessment activities. But the question really is, what are these assessment knowledge and skills of the students? And same thing with the teachers. You need to develop your assessment literacy to effectively use assessment to support students in the learning. It is your responsibility, it is our responsibility to make sure that our students understand the assessment practices and principles so that they can effectively engage in assessment. Later, I'm going to show to you a framework we developed for teacher assessment literacy. What are your roles and responsibilities? And what are the roles and responsibilities of students in relation to assessment? Now, think of this. If we teachers spend 4 years for our undergraduate degree, another 2 years for our master's degree, and 4 years in our doctorate or PhD or Doctor of Education to be effective in our teaching and teaching profession, then I think our students should devote time as well to make sure that they have understood the learning process, the theories of learning, and the assessment processes so that they can effectively engage in the learning process and assessment activities. Now, another principle is that assessment involves responsibility. The students, they contribute largely to their success, and hence they should take, they should take active roles in any assessment and learning activities. And for teachers, you need to induct students in assessment, meaning to say, before you proceed with any assessment activities, you need to make sure that students have understood everything about assessment. They have understood the learning outcomes, your expectations, what are the processes involved in grading or marking, what are the processes that they need to undertake for them to be successful. Also, you need to implement effective assessment only. Do not implement assessment activities that will not help your students to learn more effectively. Now, third, assessment requires accountability. For students, they should take ownership of their behavior and engagement in assessment and learning. So they should not make any excuses like, we are not prepared to take any assessment activities, or I'm not prepared to take the quizzes today. We have to make sure that our students will take ownership of their behavior and engagement in assessment and learning. And for teachers, you need to implement effective assessment only. You need to maximize your 30% contribution to student learning. Now, another one, assessment is a professional partnership. Students should feel and see that their teachers are their partners in learning and assessment. We need to make sure that we communicate well to the students, that if there's time that they struggle in completing the assessment activities, they can go to us and ask further clarifications and support. And for teachers, you need to work closely with students to ensure that they understand the assessment requirements. You need to provide support, feedback, and many other necessary supporting mechanism for our students. And so we need to work closely with students to guide them and to provide ongoing feedback as much as during the time that they are doing any assessment activities. Now, another one, assessment requires transparency. Students should understand the learning outcomes, expected performance, including the assessment protocol and processes. Because if they can't, or if they haven't understood the learning outcomes, the expected performance, assessment protocol, and processes, it will be really, really hard for them to engage in any assessment activities. That's why we call for assessment transparency, or transparency in assessment. And for teachers, you need to clearly articulate the learning outcomes, your expectations, assessment plan, and make sure, there's no surprises. Meaning to say, everything that you do inside the classroom should be, understood by your students. And assessment should be equitable. For students, they should develop appropriate strategies to complete all assessment tasks. And for teachers, you need to develop differentiated assessment activities to account students' diverse backgrounds and needs. Now, these 7 principles are really like a motherhood statement, and we're going to look at how could we use these 7 principles to effectively implement assessment inside our classrooms. Now, what are your roles and responsibilities? All right. So one of my major contribution is defining the teacher assessment for learning literacy, which it says the knowledge and skills to make highly contextualized, fair, consistent, and trustworthy assessment decisions to inform learning and teaching effectively to support both students and teachers' professional learning. Now here, the aim of the teacher is to build students and other stakeholders' capabilities. If you are teaching primary or elementary and high school, that include parents, and confidence to take active role in assessment, learning, teaching activities to enable and provide needed support for more effective learning. Meaning to say that us teachers, we teachers, before we engage our students in the assessment process, we need to make sure that they have understood the concept of assessment. They know what's formative assessment, they know what's summative assessment, they know what's criteria and standards, they know what's rubrics, they know all those basic concepts in assessment, because it's hard for them to engage in any assessment activities if their understanding and perception of assessment is not aligned to the principles and our practices inside the classroom. We need to make sure that we develop common language amongst students and also amongst the community, particularly if parents are involved in primary and secondary, which I understood there's high school and elementary teachers in in the watching us today as part of our participants. So that's your role and responsibilities as teachers. You need to make sure that you have the assessment knowledge and skills, and at the same time develop your students' assessment knowledge and skills as well. Now, what are these assessment knowledge and skills of teachers? So I've developed this framework, the Teacher Assessment Literacy Framework, that requires us teachers to function in 6 domains. The first one, teacher as assessor. This domain refers to teachers' knowledge and skills to develop and use a wide range of assessment strategies and tasks, and to use a comprehensive system of assessing student learning. Teachers need to continually evaluate the appropriateness, usefulness, adequacy, trustworthiness, and fairness of their assessment practices, and monitor the extent to which students are able to use the assessment information to improve the learning. Meaning to say, we need to develop not only tests, but other assessment activities, including self-assessment, peer assessment, and we're going to support our students to use these assessment activities to monitor the learning and use the information to further improve the learning. Say, for example, if you ask our students to write a reflection paper, we give them the rubrics and ask them to do self-assessment, identify their strengths, and identify 3 areas that they could further improve, and ask them to revise their reflection based on the insights taken from their self-assessment. That kind of assessment activities we need to implement inside the classroom. And that's part of our role as assessors. Now, second one, teachers as pedagogy experts. This domain refers to teachers' role or our role in reflecting on and using assessment information to inform teaching. Teachers determine students' prior knowledge, interests, and levels of ability and uses this in planning lessons and implementing the curriculum. Now, we always say that, you need to develop lesson plan and course outline, but you have to remember that your lesson plan is just your guide. It's not definitive. Say, for example, if you plan to do one activity during this particular time, and then something come up, say, for example, if you wanted to have interactive activity with your students, and then the current put off, meaning brownout, what will you do? So you're going to adapt. And then during assessment activities also, or during your lesson and teaching activities, you've seen that your students are acing, the activities. They know already what you are teaching them. Then automatically adapt to that situation, move to the next learning and teaching activities. There's no point of teaching your students if they know already the concept you're teaching. So that's what we mean by teachers as pedagogy experts, meaning to say using assessment information to adapt their learning and teaching activities. Now, the third one, teachers as student partners. This domain refers to your ability to develop and use assessment strategies and tasks to correctly engage, to actively engage students in teaching and learning activities. And our aim here is to work closely with students to provide them with a wide range of opportunities to develop their self-regulation and ability to use assessment to improve their learning. This is where close working with your students is needed. We need to make sure that we are monitoring students' learning and we are monitoring how they are progressing in terms of achieving the learning outcomes, and we need to provide them guidance, feedback, suggestions. Maybe we can give them appropriate approach if they are not meeting the target learning outcomes. And this is where we need to engage them in self-assessment, in peer assessment, and many other assessment activities. Now, the next one is teachers as motivators. This domain refers to teachers' ability to use assessment strategies and assessment information to enhance students' motivation. Now, I've said earlier that if there's one thing that students hate inside a classroom, they hate assessment, all right? So, and every assessment activity, students have emotional investment, and we need to take advantage of that emotional investment. We need to make sure that our assessment activities will motivate our students to learn more effectively and to engage more in the assessment process. Now, another one, teachers as teachers learners. This is our ability to reflect on assessment data to identify the effectiveness and appropriateness of our classroom practices, meaning to say, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what went well and what went wrong, and then how can I further improve my teaching and learning skills, particularly my assessment, knowledge and skills. Another one is teachers as stakeholder partners. This domain refers to our ability to produce tailored reports to the information needs of various stakeholders, um, and to establish continuing dialogue with these groups to communicate assessment results in ways that can be easily understood and to discuss and address any issues arising. The reports and the feedback gathered are used to identify ways to improve learning and teaching activities. There's so much that you have to learn in this framework, and I'll give the PowerPoint later to CHED, and you can access it through their website, I guess, for you to read after. I'm just being mindful of the time. I can't spend much time in this framework. Now, how about the roles and responsibilities of students? So we've seen the roles and responsibilities of teachers. How about students? So we define student assessment literacy as the possession of assessment knowledge and skills to effectively engage in assessment and learning activities. It is underpinned by the concept of accountability, in which students take full responsibility of the learning. They use this knowledge and skills to interpret the learning outcomes, assessment tasks, and criteria and standards to develop effective approach in assessment and learning. Also, they should monitor their learning against the learning outcomes and make significant decisions on how to further improve the learning. But this definition is really, really good. But when you go inside the classroom, our students don't have this assessment knowledge and skills. And so it is our responsibility to train our students to understand what assessment knowledge and skills they need to have to effectively engage in assessment and learning activities. And so this is where we need to induct our students in the assessment space. We need to make sure we provide them training. We need to make sure we tell them what's learning outcomes. We need to make sure they know what's criteria and standards and any other related concepts related to assessment. And we developed this student assessment literacy to provide framework for teachers on what assessment knowledge they need to train, or they need to develop with their students. So there are 5 domains. The first one is the general knowledge of assessment. So we need to make sure that our students understand the following concepts: assessment for learning principles, assessment processes, protocols, criteria, and standards, and many other terminologies related to assessment, the general concept of assessment. And another one, students should develop some strategies on how to appropriately approach or complete the assessment requirements. So they need to interpret learning outcomes, they need to understand criteria and standards, they need to establish learning and assessment goals based on the learning outcomes, develop appropriate assessment strategies to complete the tasks, and so on and so forth. And also, students need to engage in assessment, but they need to use their knowledge and skills related to self-assessment to identify their weaknesses, peer assessment, and to communicate feedback to their classmates. And then from self-assessment and peer assessment, they will identify key insights from exemplars and use that to complete the assessment task, how to act on feedback to feed forward, say their teachers give them 3 feedback to improve, how they're going to act on that. There's a process required to that, and students should know how to navigate in that feedback space. And using assessment to figure out what is important to learn, using criteria and standards to improve their work. And more importantly, students should monitor their learning progress. They need to identify gaps between current knowledge and skills and the expected outcomes. They need to assess current knowledge and skills against the expected outcome. They need to develop appropriate strategies to close the gaps between their knowledge and skills and the expected outcomes, and they need to monitor their achievement of learning outcomes. And lastly, they need to engage in reflective process or practice. They need to identify assessment knowledge and skills needed to succeed, assessing learning and assessment strategies implemented, asking clarification from teachers or their peers, using self-regulation, and so on and so forth. So these 5 domains with their indicators, these are the things that students need to have and to develop for them to learn more effectively and to engage effectively in the assessment process. Absence of these, say for example, if they have not understood what's feedback, the purpose of feedback, it's hard for them to act on feedback. And what I'm saying is we need to train our students from basic education, primary, elementary, high school, and higher education students. We need to train them and to ensure that they have developed this student assessment literacy. I'm supporting some schools at the moment here in New South Wales or in Sydney for primary school. And as early as year 1 or grade 1, we train students how to interpret learning outcomes, how to do self-assessment, how to establish learning goals in relation to the learning outcomes, how to do peer assessment, and how to monitor the learning against learning outcomes. And we've seen really, really good result. If you go to these schools, year 1, grade 1 students will tell you what's learning outcomes. Year 1 students will tell you what's criteria, what's rubrics, and what's peer assessment and self-assessment. We're training them in that space. Right. Now, the question about student assessment literacy, given this framework, is, are your students ready to engage in assessment? Do they have those assessment knowledge and skills? If they don't have, then do not expect a good result in terms of their learning. Although they have the required assessment knowledge and skills to succeed in the learning. So same question, related questions. And what I'm saying here is that we need to make sure that we train our students as much as we train ourselves in the space of assessment. Now, I'd like to do this assessing your assessment literacy, but I'm just being mindful of the time. You've got 20 minutes left, so I'm not going to do this. I'll quickly move to the next topic. I'll go back later to this assessment of your assessment literacy if we have time. Now, in terms of assessment design and implementation, these are 5 the questions that you have to ask yourself. What would be your basis for designing assessment tasks or activities? How many assessment tasks are needed for each course, subject, or lesson? What works well in flexible learning? How do we ensure the trustworthiness of our assessment activities and decisions? And how do we deal with the issues of academic dishonesty, copying, and plagiarism? Now, these questions, I took these questions from the questions raised in the pre-registration survey. So I'm going to answer these 5 questions. But one of the most important question here is, what would be your basis for designing assessment tasks or activities? Now, I'd like to go back to this framework, the learning, teaching, and assessment, the relationships of these 3, including the contextual factors in the middle. Now, there are prerequisites for designing assessment. 1, you need to clearly articulate the learning outcomes, and that's our outcomes-based education. If I'm going to ask you, those teaching in the higher education, university, colleges, can you clearly articulate the learning outcomes in each course that you're teaching? Now, from those learning outcomes, you need to establish the criteria and standards. Know your students, their learning needs, background, and motivation. Right? Then 4th, decide what assessment strategies would help your students to achieve the learning outcomes. Then you need to identify resources needed. Think of equity and access. Particularly, some of your students don't have ICT facilities, don't have computer, don't have internet connection. Now, are those really necessary for your students to demonstrate the expected learning outcomes? Now, reflect on your assessment literacy. Ask yourself, am I well equipped to support my students? Do I know how to engage them in self-assessment, in peer assessment? Do I know how to develop criteria and rubrics? And do I know how to give effective feedback? Then next, explore your students' assessment literacy. Do they have the assessment knowledge and skills? Right? Then you need to establish a recording monitoring mechanism, particularly in this flexible learning system that we have at the moment. And you need to clearly articulate the assessment decisions that you need to make in relation to all the student performance. So these are the prerequisites for designing assessment, which are very, very straightforward, but would require you to reflect more on your ability as teachers in relation to implementing, assessment inside a classroom. Now, the best way to answer these questions actually, or, to meet this prerequisite, is to look at the typology of assessment developed by Davison in 2007, where she says that, the assessment activities that we implement inside a classroom range from in-class contingent while teaching formative assessment to a more formal summative assessment. And so we have to develop different forms of assessment, from in-class contingent while teaching formative assessment, planned integrated formative assessment, mock or trial modeled on summative assessment, and summative assessment. So the focus of in-class contingent while teaching is on the learning process. And you, as teachers, we need to give indirect feedback, and we need to co-construct knowledge with our students. This is where the informal questioning comes inside a classroom if we are having face-to-face, or this is where reflection is required for our students. Now, the next type of assessment that we need to implement is the planned integrated formative assessment, focused on the learning process and student progress. So we need to give direct feedback, including peer feedback, self-assessment to our students, how they are actually meeting the learning outcomes. And we need to engage them in many integrated formative assessment, maybe some quizzes, maybe check-up quiz, reflection, just informal formative assessment. And then the third one, the mock or trial modeled and summative assessment, where the focus in student progress and the knowledge gap. We need to give direct feedback that include, weaknesses and how to address such. And this is where the point where we engage our students to have some sort of, advanced practice for summative assessment. So in the summative assessment, the focus here is on the product of learning. This is where we need to give marks or grades and make decisions. But at the same time, we use the results for future planning. And all this from in-class contingent while teaching formative assessment to summative assessment should give us a holistic view of student learning. Now, in operationalizing this typology of assessment, we need to go back to the learning outcomes, which are our guide, actually. So based on the learning outcomes, if you have clear learning outcomes, we know what our students should be learning, what knowledge and skills they're supposed to demonstrate after the learning and teaching activities. We can plan. We need to ask from the learning outcomes, what assessment tasks would allow students to demonstrate the learning? What criteria and standards will be used to measure student learning? And what expected level of performance, or what expected level of performance is expected? Are you expecting them to have a very, very high performance? And you need to clearly articulate that. What formative assessment strategies would help students achieve the learning outcomes? This fourth point is very, very important. And then what would be the marking protocol? How would you award marks or grades to students? Right. Now, if we know the learning outcomes and we have established the criteria and standards or rubrics, now you can actually develop, a plan for your courses or for your subjects. So you start with the in-class contingent while teaching formative assessment focused on the learning process. So these are the informal assessment or the hurdle requirement. Maybe quizzes, practice quiz, practice exams, online practice tests, practice exams, checking for understanding. These are the things that are needed here. And then in the planned integrated formative assessment, maybe you can use self-assessment, peer assessment, use of exemplars and other assessment strategies. And building on that, you need to provide practice or small tasks aligned to the major output. And then all of these three assessment strategies, from in-class to mock trials modeled on summative assessment, should contribute to the major output or performance, or should lead towards the achievement of the major output or performance. And so that's where the outcomes-based education is cemented on using the major output or performance aligned to the learning outcomes and criteria, and all other assessment activities here, informal, planned, integrated, formative, mock trial, model, and summative assessment, should contribute to the attainment of major output or performance of the students. So think of this. It's like, implementing various assessment strategies so that all the assessment experiences and outputs of the students, the processes where they were involved, should contribute to their attainment of major output or performance. Now, I'd like to show to you one course that I'm teaching and how did I plan in relation to the assessment design for that course. So I'm teaching the assessment for learning course, and I have 3 major learning outcomes. It's more, we call it standards-based assessment, but a standards-based assessment and outcomes-based education are closely, related. So because there are 3 learning outcomes, I plan to have, different assessment tasks. For in-class contingent and integrated formative assessment, meeting these learning outcomes, I require my students to take the 60-item online test, and they can only do that 3 attempts, but 3 different sets, not the same 60-item online test, which are multiple choice, true, false, and matching type. Now, the instruction there is read the assigned notes and take the test in week 3. After week 3, they should have completed this hurdle requirement. And every time they take the test that's online, it generates feedback after each attempt, especially if they get the wrong answer. It will generate a feedback and explain to them their answer. Now, the requirement is that all my students should have passed with 80%. They should be successful 80% of those 60 items. And if they fail in their 3rd attempt, they are not allowed to continue the course. So that's the first hurdle requirement. But take note, that's only a hurdle requirement, and it does not contribute to their final grade. Because my purpose there is just for them to understand, describe, and critically evaluate the key assumptions underlying assessment for learning locally and internationally. It's only conceptual understanding. I'd like them to know all these concepts related to assessment for learning. Learning outcomes 2 and 3, this is where I ask them to develop case study, and the specification is 1,500 words with 5 references. And the assessment requirements include rubrics. So I develop the rubrics, give it to them, give exemplars, and ask them to write the exemplars so that they will, develop a good understanding about the assessment task. I ask them to do self-assessment using the rubrics, and I require them to submit the self-assessment results and peer feedback results as well. They have to work closely with their peers to give feedback. And then they're going to pre-submit their case study. And then I'm going to give feedback. I'm going to identify 3 strengths and 3 areas that they need to improve. And then after, they're going to revise their case study based on my feedback, based on their classmates' feedback, and based on the results of their self-assessment. And they have to attach also written explanation how feedback was acted on. How did they use the results of self-assessment, peer assessment, and teacher feedback coming from me to improve their learning? And that accounts 40% of their total mark, which is the same with the 3rd learning outcome, which is the biggest, the expected output, the ultimate output that I'm expecting them, all knowledge that they have from learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2 should be used for learning outcome 3. And this is where they develop an assessment for learning infused curriculum. And that's 4,500 words with 10 references. I'm putting all the word limit, including the references, for transparency. And my students would know the expectations. And same thing, they're going to use rubrics, self-assessment, peer assessment, pre-submission, written explanation, and how feedback was acted on. And that accounts 60% of their final mark. But take note, even the hurdle requirement does not contribute to their total mark. That's hurdle requirement. If they can't get 80% passing mark in their third attempt, then they could not proceed with the course in week 4. So the students, but these 60 item online tests are very easy. So most of them could, ace it in first attempt, just to check their understanding related to different concepts of assessment for learning. But I require 80% passing mark because the test is quite easy. So, and then these are the distribution. So that's the design of assessment that I implement in one of my courses. Another one, we developed this blended model of assessment. Once you share learning outcomes and success criteria with your students, we've got the practice test, which is teacher controlled if you are doing synchronized online assessment. And then we give similar assessment activity to students, performance, which is student controlled. And this is where you need to develop student self-directed learning capability, where given the task, they have to engage in the assessment activities. And mostly that's online. And here in the teacher control, that's online and face-to-face. And we bring the results together to make decisions related to students' learning. So we provide students a chance to to achieve the learning outcomes by showing the performance. But at the same time, we provide also test or practice test here, which will feed to their performance in ways that they are supported. So it's a bit complicated in that sense, because two parallel assessment tasks are developed. So one for teacher controlled and one for student controlled. But these two support each other in such a way that when we make decisions, we could say that students' performance here and in student controlled and student performance in practice test are equally the same. All right. Now, here, how about assessment in modular approach? That's for blended learning, which is easy to do because we've got the capability of the ICT. Now, how would this look like in the modular approach? The earlier plan that I've shown, like if you have informal assessment, hurdle requirement, self-assessment, and peer assessment, practice small tasks aligned to the major output and major output. Now, there's a question in the pre-registration that says, how do we make sure that our students are the ones actually doing the assessment? And how do we make sure that our students are not cheating during the modular or when they are engaging in a modular approach of learning? That's a very, very interesting question, and that's a valid question. So we developed this extra layer of work. So same thing, we need to develop in-class contingent while teaching, planned integrated formative assessment, mock trial, modeled and summative assessment, and summative assessment. But there's an extra layer of work. Say, for example, you have 10 students who don't have ICT facility, don't have access to internet. And then you have module, and they have to complete all the assessment activities in the module. And then the student would say, they're going to submit a very, very good output. And then you say, wow, this is very impressive. But I doubt it if my student is actually the one who did it. So we added one extra layer of work, which there's no other way, which we need to validate student learning. This is where we can establish the trustworthiness of students' work, opportunity to validate students' output, opportunity to correct students' misconceptions. And this is the way also where we can validate our assumptions, and we can establish academic integrity to detect cheating, collusion, and etc. And so how does that look like in the actual practice? So once our students have completed all the assessment activities in the module, 3 approaches can be done. For essays, reflection, and the like, you need to interview students. If face-to-face is allowed, then they can come, after the end of the term or after the end of the semester, or the school year, and interview them related to their essay, reflection, and other assessment activities related to writing. And the moment you interview the students, you can actually gauge if they are the one who did their assessment output. Through interview, probing question, ask them to clearly articulate, the learning, ask them questions related to their essay, and you would know if they, sorry, if they're the one who did their assessment output. For math and science problems where you require students to do lots of problem sets, it's okay if they're going to give them problem sets and do that as their homework or home activity. But you need to develop also parallel tests that can be administered online if they have access to ICT, or one off session face to face, and they're going to take the test as well. All right, just a parallel kind of test so that you can determine if they have actually learned the concept related to problem solving and related processes. For output, select one aspect of the task for students to demonstrate online, or one-off session face-to-face. So if you are in the physical education, drama, arts, and dance, maybe you can ask your students just to perform just a snippet of their actual performance, or maybe if you ask your students to, if you have asked them to develop a, how do you call this, a poster, and then you can just ask them to, replicate the process, but just try to limit, a sample of that task that you ask them to do. And through this process, we found out that teachers could actually make a decision if the students have actually learned or have met the learning outcomes. And teachers could actually validate if the major output or performance of the students submitted are actually their actual output, or they are the one who develop those output. So there's no better way of doing things, but if you are doing modular approach or using modular approach, but to use validation of student learning using these three different approaches. Now the question really is, given those framework, what is the magic bullet in assessment then? Is there really a magic bullet? Now the question is, there's no magic bullet actually. The magic bullet there is use your assessment literacy to develop assessment tasks that will measure the learning outcomes, implement a range of assessment strategies to support students' learning, ensure that you develop your students' capacity to actively engage in assessment, and ensure equity and access. Answering the question, how do these assessment activities look like in online, blended, and modular platforms? I know we are in a situation where it's really, really hard to implement effective assessment strategies, but if you know the principles behind effective assessment strategies, then you can navigate yourself and think of a situation where all your students, regardless of where they are, regardless of what modality they're into, what modality they're using in terms of their learning, they can be successful to demonstrate their learning, particularly in achieving the learning outcomes. So the magic bullet there is your assessment literacy to develop assessment tasks that will measure the learning outcomes, implement a range of assessment strategies to support students' learning, ensure that you develop your students' capacity to actively engage in assessment, and ensure equity and access inside the classroom. The question now is, how confident and ready are you to design effective assessment tasks and strategies? Such a very big question, not only your readiness, but your confidence. If sometimes we found out that the teachers are ready, but they are not confident to actually design and implement assessment strategies. And these two things are very important. Readiness and confidence are two important prerequisites for you to implement effective assessment strategies. And, think of this. Assessment should support students to learn more effectively. Sorry, there's a typo there. To learn more effectively. All right. So with that, I'll leave you. And then there's another session for 15 minutes related to I hit the 4:15 time for presentation, and I think I need to give it back to Eden.
Hello, Sir Dennis. Yes, we
Hello.
still have time, sir. We can still do the activity for 10 minutes.
Okay. But that does that include the other one where the grading? No.
Yes, it can be included, sir.
Okay. Right.
Okay, thank you,
So,
sir.
thank you. All right. I'd like everyone to go back to Poll Everywhere, and let's survey your assessment literacy. Okay. Now that's in there. So there's one doing the survey, 15 surveys underway. Try to look at your assessment literacy. There are only 5 indicators that I included in there for time, and then because we are constrained with the time, but I can give you the tool later if you want to. So 39 surveys underway, and then we're going to look at your responses later, just to have some kind of self-assessment. That's very, very important, given the the topic that we have discussed. Self-assessment is one of the most influential assessment strategy to improve student learning, and not only student learning, but our skills as teachers as well. So there's 67 surveys underway, 4 surveys done, which is good. I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes to complete that.
Hello, Sir Dennis.
Yep.
So while waiting for the survey, we have seen here a live question from our Facebook. So later on, after the results of the survey, we are going to post this one, and then we can proceed to our live question and answer portion.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
No worries. All right. So keep going with the survey, and right. I just need to share my screen again. So the survey is underway. We've got 44 surveys done. Thank you for your participation with the survey. So the first question there is, I use exemplars to discuss expected outcomes before asking students to complete any assessment task. Right. So, yep, 15% says always, which is good. 39% often, sometimes. You need to make sure that we use, how do you call this? Exemplars, because that clarifies students' understanding of the expected outcome. The second one, I ask students to self-assess the work using the criteria and standards or the rubrics to identify areas for further improvement. Right. Good distribution there, 28, 30%. Well done. I ask students to submit their initial work output, and I provide feedback to further support them. Feedback in a way, not marks, but 3 or 5 insights how to further improve their work. Then another one, I engage students in peer assessment to elicit and give feedback to their classmates' work or output. So 40% are using that. Continue doing that. For those who are not using peer assessment, try to use more of it. And then at the end of the learning episode, I reflect as a teacher what assessment strategies worked well and identify key insights in how to further improve my practices. Well done. 53% keeps doing that, or always doing that. All right. So let's continue. The question of how do we compute grades or marks? Because part of this, I was requested really to, demonstrate how to compute grades or marks. But I'll be giving you a very, I would say, how will I explain this? Very revolutionary way of grading and marking, which we take here at UNSW. And the way we do it is based on the principles and concepts of effective assessment practices. So when you compute grades or award marks, now these are the questions that you need to ask first. Are grades important? Right? What does 95 mean? Say, for example, in calculus, if the student got a grade of 95, what does that mean in relation to his ability in terms of calculus? Do grades awarded to students reflect their actual learning? Say, for example, if I get 85 in my physics, does 85 really reflect my actual learning? Or did you consider external and internal factors that might have impacted students' performance, right? Internal, the motivation of the students. External, maybe they're sick during the day, or maybe, there's so much going on at the moment, and then they could not really demonstrate the learning effectively. And how do we award fair, consistent, and trustworthy grades to all students? Now, the term there is consistency and trustworthiness. That's a very big concept in assessment. And did we engage in processes that enhance the trustworthiness of the grades? And think about the socio-economic, emotional consequences of assessment grades. This is one of the area where we are exploring at the moment, the social consequences or the consequential validity of assessment. If you are familiar with the movie Three Idiots, and then there's that guy there who committed suicide because his teacher, unfairly assessed his model of, is that a helicopter or a drone? And then he committed suicide. That's a socio-economic emotional consequence of assessment. And some universities, we heard that some of the students committed suicide because they failed in their assessment. Now, the question is, do we have responsibility for those behavior of the students? I'm going to answer that later. Now, given how do we compute? Say, for example, the typology from informal assessment, hurdle requirement, self-assessment to major output and performance, how much percent should we give for each of these assessment activities that we give? For quizzes, for self-assessment, for peer assessment, participation in the class. Sometimes you give 10% participation in the class. But what does really participation mean inside a class? Would raising their hands and giving answer is part of, participation? And isn't participation part of the formative assessment, say quizzes? Because the more able students, those students who are more able, who are more, who are brighter, should we say? I don't like to use the word bright, but that's the terminology that we often use inside the classroom. So the brighter students, they are the ones who are actively participating in the class discussion. And then the quiz, same thing, they're the ones who are achieving more. So they're doubling up their performance. Now the question is that an equitable practice? Maybe yes, maybe no, depending. So the question is, how much percentage are we going to give for each of these kind of assessment? And thinking about the outcomes-based education, where the major output of the performance should have the biggest, percentage in relation to the final mark. Now, another thing that we need to think is that what if the mark based on submitted output is not consistent with the mark based on interview or actual demonstration with those students doing the modular approach? So there's a huge discrepancies. You say that you see that they've got really good output, but we interview them, and then during the actual demonstration, they could not actually demonstrate what they have submitted. Now, there's a big discrepancies there. What would be your decision? Should you fail students? Right, that's a very, very interesting topic. If you say, yeah, I'm going to fail my students because they could not demonstrate. But as a demonstration earlier, when I look at here, the hurdle requirement, I put 40, 60% and hurdle requirement. Now, reflecting back, what would be my basis for having this? The grading should have this philosophy. One, you should be clear with criteria and standards first. In essay, reflection, and related assessment outputs, after marking, select 3 student works and ask your colleagues to mark them. Look at the consistency of your marking. This is where the trustworthiness is important. We do moderation. So as practice, if we mark students' work, we select 3 and give those 3 outputs to our colleagues to mark separately. So we do double marking and look at the consistency of our marking. If our marks are very consistent with the same student output, then we accept our marks to be, fair and equitable. But if there's discrepancy, then we need to adjust the mark of the students. Now, if the discrepancies between submitted work and actual demonstrated work is really high, we need to communicate the results to the students and ask them to do supplementary assessment. But this should be clearly articulated in the beginning of the class in week 1. Say, for example, figure, the mark based on submitted output is really high, but the mark based on interview and actual demonstration, you are doubtful. So there's a huge discrepancy. Now, do not fail the student, but rather ask supplementary assessment to the students or give supplementary assessment to the students. But you can actually, you can actually control this scenario if in week 1, you need to clearly articulate, explain to your students that if your submitted work, you can't demonstrate that during the validation of your work, then you need to redo all the assessment. And that gives the students accountability and responsibility to submit only the work that they have actually developed. And that, lessens cheating in the classroom or, in learning and enhances academic integrity. But if the discrepancies are in favor of the actual demonstrated work, you might decide to adjust the mark for students' benefits. Say, for example, during validation, you found out, this student, I've given him 90, but this student is actually, showing more than what he has submitted. Then maybe I could adjust and give 95 or 92, depending on the criteria or the standards that you have developed. But again, you need to be careful of your subjectivity. And in terms of awarding percentages to assessment tasks, take an iterative process. This is a very important concept that we use in marking or in grading, the iterative process. This is based on Assessment 2020 document Boods and Associates in 2010. It says their assessment provides inclusive and trustworthy representation of student achievement. Say, interim assessment, meaning those quizzes, those class participations, the results are used for feedback on learning and progress, but do not play a significant role in determining students' final grades. That's the main argument that we are following at the moment, that those formative assessment, quizzes, participation, attendance, those are just hurdle requirements, and they should not play a significant role in determining students' final grades. The evidence of overall achievement to determine final grade is based on assessment of integrated learning, meaning to say you need to reflect and consider if your students have achieved the learning outcomes. You have to look at their performance across time and say, I think my student has demonstrated all the learning outcomes, and this student deserves a better mark than the summation of all his performances. So we call that assessment of integrated learning. And certification and accurately and richly portrays graduates and students' achievements to inform future careers and learning. This applies to higher education. And so, say for example, what do we mean by iterative process of grading? So if we have 4 assessment activities in the classroom, we've got assessment 1 that measures learning outcomes 1 and 2. We say, well, that contributes to 10% because that's only quizzes, weekly quizzes. Assessment 2, learning outcomes, will measure learning outcomes 1, 2, 3. That's another 10%. This is just a simple report that I require my students, so it's a very, very minimal. That will contribute only to 10% of their final mark. And assessment 3 will measure learning outcomes 2, 3, and 4. And this is a bigger task, and it's patterned to the final output. I'll give 20% to that. And the final output, which is aligned to our outcomes-based education, will measure all learning outcomes, the 5 learning outcomes, and it's a bigger task, and that will sum up to 60% of the final mark or final grade of the students. So in principle, what we do is just to do the summation. We take 10% from assessment 1, 10% in assessment 2, 20% in assessment 3, then 60% in the final output, and then get the sum. And supposing we've got, student A, he got 65% in assessment 1, 78% in assessment 2, 80% in assessment 3, and 90% in the final output. If you take the percentages, that will give 84.3%, and you award the final grade of the student as 84 if you round it off. And so the question is 84 a true reflection of students' achievement of the 5 learning outcomes? Would you give 84 straight on because due to the computation that you have? But going back to the concept of iterative process and the assessment of integrated learning, where you need to reflect, if I were the teacher of this course, of this student, what I'm going to do is to ask and reflect. What is this assessment 1 trying to achieve? Why is my student getting only 65%, this particular student? And assessment 2, why there is an increase here? Why it's 78%? Now, in assessment 3, there's a significant increase again. Does this increase an evidence that this student is learning effectively after engaging in assessment 1 and 2? And in the final output, does the final output allow student to demonstrate all learning outcomes? And if I see that the final output of the student, he was able to demonstrate all learning outcomes, he's learning from assessment 1, 2, 3, making up the final output, and I see why is it that he's getting 90%, because he was able to learn everything after assessment 3 and use those knowledge and skills to come up with the final output. That's why he got 90%. Then based on the principle of iterative process and integrated learning, I will give 90% as the final mark of the students. And that's based on the principle of outcomes-based education, because at the end, we are after of the final outcome of the course. If my student was able to demonstrate the final output in a very, very high level, then in all manner, I have to ignore the other results of assessment, because we are just using assessment 1, assessment 2, and assessment 3 as building blocks for the attainment of the final output. At the end of the day, you need to go back to the purpose of learning, which is to achieve the learning outcomes. So this is kind of a very radical, approach to marking or grading that we are actually implementing at the moment. And we see that because of this, we are making a very, very consistent judgment to student work. And most of our students, actually, because of this kind of iterative process and assessment of integrated learning, they do they invest more time in assessment 1, 2, and 3, because they know that all the knowledge and skills that they learn and demonstrate in these 3 assessments are actually needed in their final output. The first year we implemented this kind of iterative process of grading and integrated assessment of learning, we found that the students there's this common notion that maybe students will not perform in assessment 1 and assessment 2 because they will just do the final output. But we are wrong with our assumptions, because after the second term where we implement this one, we found that our students have significant, the performance of our students in assessment 1, 2, and 3 are really, really high, because they know that the knowledge and skills that they're trying to develop in assessments 1, 2, and 3 are actually contributing to the final output. So if they want to have a very good final grade or final mark, then they have to do better as well in assessment 1, assessment 2, and assessment 3, because they could not produce a really good final output if their knowledge prior to are not that high. So we are adopting this one, and we are implementing this one. And this is a very radical view of marking or awarding grade, that we have the autonomy to ignore results of prior assessment, provided that the final output will allow our students to demonstrate all the learning outcomes in the course, right? So again, based on that, I'm going to ask, what is the magic bullet in assessment? All right, that might not be that kind of grading might not be relevant in the Philippines, or may not be well received at the moment. But try to think, because there's much wisdom behind that kind of marking if you reflect the principles of assessment practices and how we can support our students to learn more effectively. Remember, at the end of the day, we are implementing assessment to support our individual students to learn more effectively. And I think I need to stop there. And yep, give back the floor to Iren for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Dennis, for that very informative presentation on assessment principles and strategies. And I know for sure that all our audience gain a lot of insights and tips from your presentation. Okay, and for the audience, you can post your questions in the comment section of HECBOL Facebook or YouTube. And this time, let's see the questions from our live audience. Okay, Dr. Dennis, here's the first question po from Miss Rita, from Ma'am Rita. So, what are your thoughts in giving only one high-stake summative exam per semester for a one-year course? So, there are formative quizzes only. If yes, what percent should it be of the whole entire grade of students?
All right. So I think that question somewhat answered with my illustration. If you have only one final summative assessment in one course for one term, you have to make sure that you provide a lot of opportunities for your students to practice their knowledge and skills so that they can be successful to achieving the final, summative assessment. But if your formative assessments are not contributing to the summative assessment, then you have to rethink the way you give summative assessment. We have to make sure that we are helping our students to be successful in summative assessment. So if you have one final summative assessment, then you would have a lot of practice tests so that your students will be successful in your summative assessment. So you go back to the concept of assessment of integrated learning, or our iterative process. And what if your student B failed the summative assessment, but during the formative assessment he was actually excelling, he was actually meeting the targets? What will be your decision? Should you fail the student because your student failed the one final summative assessment? Go back to the concept of iterative process, go back to the concept of assessment of integrated learning, and reflect based on that, and you can get an answer. For me, if that student is actually meeting targets in formative assessment but then failed in summative assessment, then two things I might do. One, to give him another chance for summative assessment, or look at the results of his formative assessment and draw a conclusion related to how that student has actually demonstrated or achieved the learning outcomes.
Wow, very good insight, sir. So not really automatically fail the student, but there must be reflection, in the part of the teacher.
I hate to say that failing is an approach to learning. There's so much that we can do to assist individual students. And it's a way of changing the way we look at assessment and changing our philosophy related to learning and teaching. But there are students who would really fail because they are not motivated. But if students are motivated, then it's easy to provide enabling and supporting mechanisms for them. So yeah.
That's right, sir. I agree on that. Like as teachers, we really need to motivate our students to learn more and do more, not only in subject, but also in performance based. All right, so let's move to the next question, sir, Dr. Dennis. All right, in our screen, here's a question from Ms. Ajarani. So how can we effectively do peer assessment for students who have poor or no internet connectivity, especially in the BARMM region, sir?
Right. Now, the effect size of peer assessment and self-assessment are quite comparable. So if your students have no connectivity or they don't have access to their peers, then use self-assessment. Provide them with the rubrics, clear rubrics. Ask them to mark their output using the rubrics, and ask them to identify 3 things that they could improve, and ask them to to integrate their feedback. I was looking at my my laptop. It's actually draining. Give me 1 second to charge it. Sorry for that.
So you can still post your question in our comment section, and please don't forget to subscribe and like our Facebook, HECBOL Facebook page, and of course our YouTube channel. Yeah, after this 9th webinar, of course, we are expecting for another webinar next week. So please stay tuned and always be updated in our activities. So after this, we are going to have the next question. So let's first cater the second. Yeah, it's okay, Sir Dennis. Yeah, so going back, so how are we going to address assessment for students who have poor or no internet connection?
Yeah, instead of using peer assessment, just use self-assessment. They have comparable effects in terms of, improvement of student learning. So just use self-assessment, give them the rubrics, ask them to identify 3 things that they need to improve, and ask them to integrate that feedback and, revise their work. So yeah, if you can't do peer assessment, then don't force yourself. Go for other assessment strategy.
So basically, we must not be contained in one assessment strategy. So there are a lot of things to consider.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. So moving on, for the third question from Ma'am Andas. So here it is. Actually, comment first and a question later. So if we follow this design, so maybe she's talking about the design you presented, no student will enroll in the class of the teacher. So the psychology of many students here, there are some who would dare or prefer less challenging assessment design. So how do we adjust to the capacity and capability if you have them in your own class? Yeah, talking about the realistic side.
Yep. We acknowledge that students really hate assessment. But if we could change the way students look at assessment, that it's an integral part of their learning, they couldn't learn anything if they don't engage in any assessment activity, then we change their perception and conception about assessment. That's why we are always emphasizing that we need to build students' assessment literacy and their understanding of the different concepts of assessment. And one of the key things inside the classroom is that it's not actually lowering the standards, but rather setting up a very high expectations and knowing your students and knowing what support they need to achieve those expectations that you have. It's not actually lowering down. It's actually the concept of load reduction, instruction, and assessment, where you have to start from the easy task, then building on to the next one. It's like a Piagetian theory of learning. If you know Piaget, he said that you need to start from the low-level competencies and then move to the next, move to the next. There's no point of starting from the top where your students are down here. You need to know where your students are in the definition of assessment for learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. And that's underpinned by the Vygotsky zone of proximal development as well, the sociocultural perspective of assessment, where you need to work where your students need really support. That's the zone of proximal development for education majors there. You know what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
zone of proximal development. And that's where you need to start building up the assessment activity for your students to achieve the higher outcomes. And you have to remember that you need to set high outcomes, because if you can't provide support to your students, they would really achieve that. And yeah, start with the low level, even with Bloom's taxonomy. That's from comprehension up to creating something. So it's not lowering down, it's actually working where your students are, knowing where they need to go, and supporting them to address the gap in their learning.
Wow. I remembered ZPD way back college days. Yeah.
It's very, very useful theory to think about learning, teaching, and assessment activities based on sociocultural perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, Sir Dennis. And I really do agree with you that we have to start from the basic, going up to the highest level. So take it like milestones per maybe
That's right.
per assessment. Okay, thank you so much. So let's have another question, please. All right, from Ma'am Andes again. So she's very participative. Thank you, ma'am. So I like the idea of interviewing them to verify honesty. How about if you have a class of 50 or more? So how are you going to go about it, sir? Can you
Okay,
suggest some
right.
strategies?
Now the context has changed, and we're talking about new normal. And if we are still doing exactly the same thing from the policy perspective, from the admin perspective, then we are not changing. Meaning to say, if this new normal, as we call it, we're going to adapt, then we need to review also our expectations in relation to workload. Especially if you're working as a principal or administrator, think of the workload implications of all these things. If we wanted to really implement a new normal with all these changes that we wanted to see, and with all these mechanisms that we wanted to implement, then we need to look at also workload implications for teachers. You know, the workload that we have before, say for example in university, in public state university and colleges, if one semester is 18 units and that's 6 subjects, maybe you have to reduce that one because the workload is different in the new normal. If you're going to insist that the same workload for the new normal, then logic will tell you that we are failing in terms of adapting to the new normal. It's actually trying to look at not only how we implement, but what policy, what practices, what support should be implemented to support both teachers and students. In our experience, our workload has been reduced significantly because the admin people recognized that it's very impossible to have the same workload with the new normal. We need to ring our students. We need to meet them through Zoom one-on-one, 20 to 30 minutes, and that's very, very tasking to do that. So yeah, interviewing to verify honesty of the students. If we go to that space, then we need to look at workload implications for teachers. And yeah, I'm going to say we need to really look at the workload implications because we're saying new normals, but still we're doing the same thing. Then we are actually, negating to that new normal thingy.
Yeah. So the keyword here, I think, is flexibility in doing your strategy despite
And
of the
looking at the
workload.
workload implications as well from the admin people. What support should admin give to teachers and students?
Yeah, especially now that we are dealing with a lot of changes in our environment.
That's right.
Okay. So I think we will cater one more question, Dr. Dennis. So here's from Mr. Alex Tolentino. So what method would you suggest in regards to giving major exams during the new normal? Major exam.
Right. This is quite challenging because I'm teaching at the moment the graduate certificate for university learning and teaching. And one of the concerns of my students are professors, associate professors, and lecturers in the university, is that those coming from science, maths, statistics background, where they need to have major exams. So we tried one assessment activity fully online. Fully online. It's the how do you call this? The platform is open for 24 hours, and the students should complete, uh, within 24 hours. We found out so many cheatings, and that
Wow.
didn't work. So we implemented another strategy where each student has a different problem set. But that requires a lot of investment of time from the teacher. And so we look at the workload implication again. Now, one thing that we find it beneficial is to give students practice tests, one practice test, but series of questions, and then ask them to go to university in like 2 or 3 people in a day, social distancing, physical distancing, and take the final test face to face. There's no other way to navigate in this way, but we just need to be very, very creative and to be practical in ways that will help us, navigate in this particular context. But if online test will work, then go for it. And yeah.
Yeah, so it's really a matter of strategy. But of course, we really have to abide with the guidelines implemented by the government.
That's right.
All right, so in the interest of time, we are bound to end our webinar. So in this regard, I would like to thank you, Dr. Dennis, for sharing your expertise to all our viewers here, not only in BARMM, in Philippines, but even abroad. So thank you very much. You are truly a Filipino pride. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I mean, I hope some of the things, that I've discussed will stir your discussion related to assessment, because for so many years that I work in the Philippines, 14 years been working in the Philippines before I went here, our assessment practices is quite very, very low. We're stuck to the idea of grading, marking. We're stuck to the idea of examinations. But in the few years that I was there, when I went back in 2015 and 2017, there's slight changes, and we can sustain that changes in terms of implementing new and creative and innovative approaches in assessment. And try to think, if we use assessment inside a classroom, that's to support students in the learning. There's no other purpose of assessment. Yeah. So thank you for having me, and yeah, all the best for your teaching in the coming years. Thank you.
So thank you very much again, Dr. Dennis. And I know for sure that our audience have a lot of takeaways and insights gained from you, very commendable speaker. So again, in behalf of CHED-HECBOL team, headed by Dr. Nelia A. Alibin, my colleagues Sir Jean, Yanni, and Ephraim, we would like to thank you for the continued support in our activities. So more webinars will be given, so please don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So feedback form of this webinar will be sent within an hour after to those who have pre-registered. You can fill out the feedback form until July 27, 2020 at 5 p.m. So after filling out, you will receive your certificates via email. So as James Harrington said, that measurement is the first step to gain control and eventually to improvement. This has been Eden Stephanie Bolido, your host for today, saying, as we continue to improve, we can always ensure quality. We educate as one, CHED-HECBOL Online. Good afternoon, everyone.
Welcome to CHED Connect, a higher education open educational resource application. CHED Connect contains higher education materials which are useful for teaching, learning, and research purposes. It allows learners and educators to access content anytime, anywhere, free of charge. No registration needed. Just type in the keyword of the topic you wish to search. Click on the categories of the Philippine Standard Classification of Education and browse your way to its rich content. CHED Connect is easy to use. Just key in your area of interest. The site offers different relevant and interesting materials to choose from. Scholarly prepared, accomplished, and uploaded by competent faculty members and contributors from various partner Philippine higher education institutions. Guided by the principles of open educational resources, these materials such as PDF, audio files, ebooks, presentations, videos, and many more are very beneficial. CHED Connect. We educate as one.